If the Cold War had ever turned into a full-scale nuclear war, the world today would look very different. During the height of tensions in the mid-1960s to the early 1980s, both the United States and the Soviet Union were fully prepared to launch thousands of nuclear weapons. There were warheads on land, on submarines, and on planes, all ready to strike at a moment's notice. This wasn't just about one or two bombs either. We're talking about complete nuclear exchanges that would have wiped out entire cities across Europe, North America, and Asia. It would have started fast, maybe just one false alarm or a political misstep, and within minutes, missiles would have been in the air. The first wave of nuclear strikes would have been aimed at military targets. Places like missile silos, air bases, and naval ports would have been hit first to try to weaken the enemy's ability to respond, but even with that strategy, the fallout would have reached cities nearby. Towns close to military facilities would have been destroyed right away. After that, both sides would have gone after major population centers. Cities like New York, Washington, Moscow, and Leningrad would have been vaporized within the first hour. Hundreds of millions of people would have died almost instantly. Anyone within the blast zones would have stood no chance, and the fires that followed, called firestorms, would have torn through everything left standing. Radiation would have spread across the globe in a matter of days. Fallout from the bombs would ride the wind into every corner of the planet. Crops would have died from contaminated soil, water supplies would have turned poisonous, and animals would start to disappear. People who survived the blast would have faced radiation sickness, burns, and long-term cancers. In rural areas, survivors might have avoided the initial destruction, but they would have faced a slow and brutal aftermath. No electricity, no working governments, and barely any food. Most emergency plans didn't account for something this massive. By the end of the first month, the world's population could have dropped by over 1 billion people. Most major cities in both the West and the East would be gone. There wouldn't be internet, there wouldn't be global trade, and the entire world economy would have collapsed overnight. Countries that stayed neutral, like Switzerland or Sweden, might have survived better, but they still would have had to deal with fallout and food shortages. The global climate would have already started to change from the smoke in the sky, and that's where the real long-term problems would begin. After the first wave of nuclear strikes and the total collapse of major cities, the world would have entered a survival phase. With no working governments, no communication, and no supply chains, everyday life would have broken down completely. Hospitals would be overwhelmed or destroyed. There would be no medicine, no doctors in most places, and no way to transport the injured. In the cities that weren't hit directly, panic would spread fast. Grocery stores would empty in hours. Gas stations would run dry. Most people would be on their own with no help coming. The skies would darken within weeks. Hundreds of nuclear detonations would have kicked up so much ash and soot into the atmosphere that sunlight would struggle to reach the surface. This is what scientists call nuclear winter. Temperatures around the world would begin to drop fast. Even in places like Africa and South America, where the bombs didn't fall, crops would fail from the sudden cold and lack of light. In the United States, Europe, Russia, and China, farms would stop producing food almost completely. Animals would starve or freeze, and most people wouldn't be able to grow anything at all. There wouldn't be enough food for even a fraction of the survivors. Power plants that weren't destroyed would shut down due to lack of workers, fuel, or maintenance. Nuclear reactors, if not properly shut down, could become unstable. That raises the risk of meltdowns, adding even more radiation to an already poisoned world. Water systems would break down too. Without electricity, there's no way to purify water or pump it to homes. Rivers and lakes would be contaminated with radioactive fallout, and most people would end up drinking unsafe water. Diseases like cholera and dysentery would return fast, especially in crowded shelters or refugee camps. In the countries that weren't part of the war, maybe parts of South America, Southeast Asia, or small island nations, survival would depend on isolation. But even then, trade routes would be gone. Medical supplies, fuel, and imported food would stop arriving. These places would suffer from the global collapse even if no bombs fell on them. Over time, small local governments might try to take control, but there wouldn't be much to work with. It would be a world without law, without stability, and without much hope. Humanity wouldn't go extinct right away, but modern civilization as we know it would be finished. By the third phase of this alternate Cold War reality, the initial shock of nuclear strikes and the breakdown of society would have already happened. Now, what would follow is a slow, brutal adjustment to a world that could no longer support modern life. Governments would no longer exist in their old form. Instead, scattered pockets of authority might emerge. Local militias, community leaders or even former military units trying to restore some kind of order, but they'd be operating with almost nothing. No fuel, no technology, and no way to communicate over long distances. The age of global coordination would be over. Cities that weren't hit by bombs would face their own challenges. Many would be flooded with refugees fleeing radioactive zones. These cities wouldn't be prepared to take in thousands or even millions of survivors. The infrastructure would collapse under the pressure. In colder parts of the world, people would freeze to death during the first post-war winter. In warmer regions, clean water and shelter would be the biggest concern. Diseases would spread fast without modern sanitation or medicine. Without reliable food sources, people would start eating whatever they could find: rats, insects, spoiled leftovers. In some places, cannibalism would eventually become a desperate reality. Technology would stop advancing. Most scientists and engineers would either be dead or scattered. Laboratories would be destroyed. Universities would be abandoned. Knowledge would still exist in books and computers, but there'd be no power to access digital archives and no stable education system to pass on complex skills. Within one generation, even basic things, like how to filter water or generate electricity, could be lost. The skills that mattered would change. Farming, scavenging, and building shelter would become far more important than coding or economics. People who had once worked in offices might now be digging for edible roots or trying to trap animals just to survive. Wildlife and ecosystems would suffer too. Nuclear winter would kill off many plant species, especially crops. Animals that rely on steady seasons, like birds or certain insects, would struggle to survive the sudden cold. Forests would wither without sunlight. Oceans would become more acidic from the fallout and collapse of food chains. Fish and sea mammals would die off in huge numbers. Some scientists estimate that even a small nuclear exchange could push several thousand species into extinction. In a full-scale Cold War nuclear war, the impact would be much worse. The natural world would not bounce back quickly. At the same time, parts of the planet far from the main targets, maybe places like Madagascar, New Zealand, or remote parts of South America, might become accidental safe zones. These regions could serve as the last outposts of human survival, but they'd face their own battles: isolation, limited supplies, and the psychological toll of knowing most of the world had ended. Survivors in these places might eventually build new communities, but they'd be starting over from scratch, with the memory of the old world haunting every step forward. In the final phase of a nuclear Cold War scenario, as the dust settled and the world adapted to its new reality, the long-term consequences would be felt for generations. The global climate, still reeling from the nuclear winter, would remain unstable for years, maybe even decades. The cooling temperatures and lack of sunlight would lead to widespread crop failures. Agriculture would become much more difficult. People would have to rely on more primitive farming techniques, growing whatever crops could survive in the cold, often with minimal tools and resources. The global food system would be completely restructured, with local farming becoming the primary way to feed the few who remained. Even those who had managed to survive the initial chaos would face a bleak future. Disease would still be a major threat. With healthcare systems collapsed and no medicine or antibiotics to treat infections, people would be living in a constant state of vulnerability. The survivors would be dependent on whatever resources they could scavenge or trade for, as money would no longer have much value in a world where everyone was just trying to survive the next day. Communities would form around essential needs like food, water, and shelter, but trust would be scarce. Human nature in such dire conditions would lead to desperation. The possibility of violence over resources such as land, water, or food would be constant. The psychological toll would be another challenge. People would have witnessed the destruction of cities, the death of loved ones, and the collapse of everything they knew. In a world where history and knowledge were slipping away, people would lose much of their identity. Survival itself would be the only focus, but even that would be a struggle. Memories of the old world would remain, but they'd feel increasingly distant. Survivors might look up at the sky, once filled with the promise of space exploration and progress, and now filled with smoke and ash, and wonder if humanity could ever rebuild from what had happened. Looking beyond the immediate destruction, the future would be one of uncertainty. The survivors who managed to hold on through the chaos might rebuild a new society, but they would do so with the lessons of the old world hanging over them. The world might be smaller now, with much of the population gone and infrastructure destroyed. It could take centuries before humanity would even begin to approach the level of development it once had. The question of how to prevent something like this from happening again would be a difficult one to answer, especially when so much of the world's knowledge and history had been erased. As time passed, the memory of the Cold War's threat would fade, but the scars would remain. There would be no going back to the way things were, and humanity would be left to pick up the pieces in a world where survival was no longer guaranteed. The echoes of a nuclear disaster would serve as a constant reminder that, in the end, the weapons we created to ensure our security could also be the very thing that destroyed us. The future of the world would depend on how humanity chose to rebuild and whether we could learn from the mistakes of the past